So wait a minute, by clicking on this channel, you think you made a mistake? No, 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 no. If you are a fan of true crime, mysterious stories, or the paranormal, you are in the right place. This is Mystery Files, and I am Mystery Files. So, I got a great story for you today, and it's one that's gonna have you being like, what is going on? But that's okay, because that's what we do here. And this is on the mysterious side. Without any further ado, as of now, it's time to slip into a mind that's not our own. Let's go. On October 24th, 1961, in a wealthy part of Lincoln, Massachusetts, Mrs. Joan Risch was a married mother of two and had moved into that area with her husband to raise her family. She had a 4-year-old daughter and an infant son. On this day, her husband was away on a business trip, and she had allowed her daughter to go see her next-door neighbor named Barbara Barker, while Mrs. Risch stayed at home to keep watch of her infant son, who was taking a nap. But when the daughter came back from the neighbor's home, she stayed only a few moments inside of her house, because then she had to race back out to the neighbor's house to report that her mother was not at home, and there was this red paint that was all over the walls inside the house. The red paint was in fact blood, and it trailed out of the house to Mrs. Risch's car in the driveway. And in the kitchen, the phone was ripped off from the wall, and the phone book was lying open on the page for emergency service telephone numbers. And in those days, there was no centralized 911 like there is now. Also, a table had been turned over, and there was a bloody handprint that was on the wall. All the signs indicated that Mrs. Risch had been abducted, but there were several strange aspects to this case that have baffled many people for many decades. For one thing, there were odd witness sightings of Mrs. Risch that caused confusion. I mean, one neighbor reported that they had seen Mrs. Risch running outside of her house that afternoon. The neighbor had assumed that Mrs. Risch was simply running after her child, but the neighbor had noted that she looked anxious. And it is also quite possible that Mrs. Risch had been the woman who drivers had seen walking along Route 128, which was being constructed at the time. Drivers had later reported that they'd seen a woman matching her description who appeared to either have blood or mud all over her legs. Again, their description of her demeanor was that she looked anxious and distressed and disoriented, but oddly, no one bothered to stop and ask her if she was okay or to offer any assistance. Mrs. Risch's neighbor, Mrs. Barker, recalled how she had seen Mrs. Risch outside her house at around 2:30 p.m. that day, wearing a skirt, sweater, and a gray trench coat. But also, Mrs. Barker remembered seeing Joan carrying something red, but did not know what it was. The original police report states that at 2:45 p.m., a woman was spotted walking along the side of the road with the flow of traffic, and that she appeared to be walking aimlessly, shuffling along and hunched over, as though cold, and she was untidy in appearance. Then at some time just after 3:15 p.m., the same woman was seen again walking on the highway, a heavy concentration of blood streaming down both of her legs, and appeared to be in a dazed and confused condition. Her hands were cradled to her stomach as though carrying something. Then at 4:35 p.m., she was seen again on the roadside. This time, the woman's legs, both front and back, were covered with what appeared to be blotches of brownish colored mud. She walked with her head pitched forward and her hands in both of her pockets. Now, the mud could have been mud or dried blood, and when the police arrived at the scene, they searched the house for her, and then issued a bulletin for all police to search the surrounding areas with bloodhounds. Then, Mrs. Risch's husband was summoned home from his business trip, arriving late in the night to be questioned, and he explained where he had been and when, and this was all corroborated by the police. It did not look like he had anything to do with his wife's sudden and unexpected disappearance. And when questioned about the disarray in the kitchen, Mr. Risch said he saw nothing out of place aside from the blood and the ripped out telephone, but added that he could not explain why there were some empty beer bottles. And then the next day, the FBI joined into the hunt for Mrs. Risch, after no trace of her was found in the neighborhood nor in the woods. Further details emerged about the last day where she had been seen. She had spent that morning running errands, and later that morning 2 tradesmen had called at her house, and they said that she had been in good spirits when she was talking with them. And it was around 2:30 p.m. that she had been seen by the next door neighbor, walking very fast and carrying that something red. Neighbors also later reported that they had seen an unknown gray/blue sedan car parked in her driveway at around 3 p.m. You'd think that's something they would have noticed earlier, but the police concluded that this was an unmarked police car. What? And that the timing given by the neighbors was slightly incorrect. The neighbors who had seen the car, however, continued to insist that this was an unidentified vehicle and they had not got the time wrong. So there does remain some discrepancy there. I mean, if, as the police said, it was an unmarked police car, but the neighbors got the time correct, why would it have been there before she disappeared? And in respect to all the highway sightings of Mrs. Risch, the police developed a theory that because it was being constructed at the time, perhaps she had fallen into an excavated ditch and then been covered over by the foliage, and concrete then poured in over her, covering her up forever. And that's when, like usual, Mystery Files walked in and said, "What kind of police department is this? Who comes up with a theory like that?" Well, if she's there, why don't you just dig in the concrete? And while doing that, make sure to subscribe and hit that like button, because guess what? If we get up to 50 likes, you guys get a bonus story this week. And then I told them their theory was pitiful. They eventually saw my side of things, offered me an honorary badge, but I declined and then hopped back in my spaceship. And as for the evidence inside the family home, despite the telephone directory having been found opened at the list of emergency numbers, no calls had been made from the home that day. And her son, the infant, was discovered still sleeping soundly when the alarm had been raised. So whatever happened to her, it didn't wake him up. Then we're gonna go upstairs, and that's where police found some blood in her bedroom and blood smeared in the kitchen, but there were no bloody footprints anywhere in the house. And as for the bloody fingerprints left in the kitchen, these were never identified. But you see, Mrs. Risch's fingerprints had never been taken, as she had never been in trouble with the police. So it was also impossible to say whether they were her fingerprints or those of an unknown intruder, who also did not have a police file with his or her fingerprints. And it was noted by the police that in the kitchen, an attempt had been made to mop up the blood on the floor with the use of a kitchen towel. And this method had not mopped up all the blood. So whether this was a half-hearted attempt or the person attempting to do it had been interrupted, the police did not know. It's also not known if this was done by Mrs. Risch herself or an unnamed assailant. The only thing missing that belonged to Mrs. Risch was a thin coat. Now, this was a different coat to the coat that she had been seen in the neighborhood wearing earlier, when she had been, carrying something red. Her purse, however, was still in the house, as well as any other personal items that she would have needed to deliberately disappear. And the investigation into her inexplicable disappearance was so thorough that the district attorney was even handed a list of books that she had recently borrowed from the local library in an attempt to uncover anything in her life that could lead to the explaining of why she disappeared. Although it looked like a clear case of abduction, without any fingerprints on file that matched those in the house, and without any ransom note or any further sightings of her, the police needed to find out if perhaps she could have wanted to disappear voluntarily and had somehow planned it all out. So the district attorney, with a ready-to-go team of librarians from the local library, went through the books and discovered that the vast majority of books Mrs. Risch had borrowed all focused on the topic of murder or disappearances. Getting interesting, eh? Well, what seems so clear-cut is not so clear-cut anymore, is it? That's why I chose this case. One book in particular even seemed to echo the details of her own disappearance. The story revolved around the case of a woman who had vanished without a trace, leaving behind a pool of blood and a towel that had been used to partially mop the blood up off the floor, exactly like the scene in Mrs. Risch's own kitchen. So people wonder now, could she have used these books as somewhat learning manuals in which to plan her own staged disappearance? I mean, had she staged the scene to make it look like an intruder had entered her home and abducted her, just like the one in her books? And this was also way before the days of the internet, so any sleuthing would have had to been done with boots on the ground, and how could she do this with 2 small children? It just doesn't make any sense as well. Also, wouldn't she have kept notes? If she had been investigating something, perhaps she had aspirations to write a murder mystery herself. She had worked in publishing. Her husband said that one of her interests was writing prose and poetry, and her degree was in English literature. And over the decades since it happened, sleuths have latched onto the fact that her reading choice of more than 25 books on disappearance and murders must have meant she had been planning her own disappearance. Let me know before I finish what you guys think right now. Do you think she was taken, or do you think she staged it? Comment right now. Because think of this, and how many millions of people across the world love reading murder mystery books and yet are not contemplating using the plots in those books to plan their own disappearance? I mean, think about it. You yourself would not be watching me right now if you weren't at least a little bit interested in murder mystery. But don't get me wrong, it has happened though. Killers have taken inspiration from novels or films. So was she really sick of being a housewife? And did that inspire her to straight up cut ties with everybody and disappear on her own? Well, if she had done that, there have never been any sightings of her. And in publishing, or anywhere else for that matter, or at least we haven't found it yet, the trail literally went cold almost immediately after she disappeared that day, with the bloodhounds even getting no hits on her scent. It didn't even seem likely that she had been picked up by a driver along the highway as she stumbled along it. But if she did, and I mean that surely would have been unlikely and horrible bad luck to have escaped an abductor or assailant in her own home, and then to go walk on the street to get help, and then somebody picks her up and she gets abducted again by a driver acting as a good Samaritan. That's just too much, I think. Unless she had managed to flee her attacker in her home and make it to the highway only for him to catch up with her and then grab her in the car and abduct her. But wait, then there were also mysterious phone calls. One day in November, several weeks after she had last been seen, an unidentified female caller phoned the home more than 10 times in one day. And at that time, the missing woman's father-in-law had come to stay with his son, the missing woman's husband. And he told the police that this female had repeatedly phoned the house, but that she had refused to talk to him. And on that very same day, a neighbor reported that a very animated and agitated female had phoned her house, expressing anxiety that she had been calling the Risch household, but that she had not been able to speak with anyone she knew there. Who was this mystery woman? Because if it had been Mrs. Risch herself, one would imagine that her father-in-law would have recognized her voice. I mean, although the woman would not speak to him about what she wanted to say, he did hear her voice, but he did not believe it was his daughter-in-law calling. I mean, why would the woman not talk to him? What did she want to say, and how is this connected to the case? Could Mrs. Risch have had an accident in the house? And then had she somehow cut herself or knocked her head on something and wandered out in a state of shock and almost with amnesia, suffering from a concussion, leading to confusion and disorientation? I mean, could that be why she attempted to clean up the blood and overturn the chair? I mean, had she tried to summon an ambulance with the phone book open to the emergency numbers? But still, that doesn't explain where she went and why no one ever saw her again. On the other hand, the phone book was found on the floor. So could it possibly have fallen open at that exact page right in front of the emergency numbers by chance? Adding to this tragedy, newspaper reports from the time stated that as a child, she possibly might have been assaulted herself. Then there was the fact that her parents were killed in an unexplained fire at their home in 1940 when she was only age 9. The history of Mrs. Risch's life and her mysterious disappearance is still unsolved. So maybe everybody that sees this should share it, and who knows, maybe she's still out there alive somewhere, and maybe we'll be able to find her. I know this episode is very confusing, a lot of moving parts, but it was definitely a story that had to be told. That's all I got for you guys today. Make sure to get this up to 50 likes and share it. I appreciate and I love you guys, and I'll talk to you later. Cheers.